A serene afternoon in the palace. Julius Caesar sits in quiet contemplation while
Imagine walking through the quiet streets of ancient Rome, centuries ago, as the city holds its breath after decades of wars and conspiracies. In a grand hall, Julius Caesar sits with his closest allies, Brutus, Cassius, and others, discussing plans, alliances, and the future of an empire, while every subtle gesture and word carries the weight of history. Tonight, you will follow every moment of their days, overhear the conversations that shaped a world, and drift slowly into the calm rhythm of Rome itself. Join me and let the story of ambition, loyalty, and quiet power carry you through a journey unlike any other, one peaceful hour at a time.
The quiet world before Caesar. The air over the 7 hills of Rome in the decades before Gaius Julius Caesar began his ascent was often thick with the smell of wood smoke, old plaster, and the faint, ever-present odor of human habitation. The sun, in the early hours of a summer morning, would slowly begin to warm the damp stone of the massive city. It was a city of slow, deliberate awakenings. Before the sun fully cleared the eastern horizon, the narrow, winding streets, the Vici, were still cloaked in deep shadow. These lanes were hemmed in by the tall, multi-story apartment buildings, the insulae, where most of the city's population lived. These buildings, often poorly constructed of brick and timber, scraped against each other, nearly touching overhead, leaving only a faint strip of morning sky visible to those walking below. A few torches, flickering faintly, might mark the stall of a baker or a water carrier preparing his day. The sounds were muted. The clatter of a heavy bronze bowl, the creak of a cartwheel on the rough cobblestones, and the soft shuffling of sandaled feet. The noise of Rome, that ceaseless, echoing roar that would define the middle of the day, had not yet begun. In contrast, high on the Palatine and the Esquiline hills, and in the more exclusive quarters, stood the domus, the private homes of the senatorial elite. These houses were quieter, larger, and surrounded by high walls, often featuring a central open-roofed courtyard, the compluvium, designed to catch rainwater. Within these homes, the paterfamilias, the head of the house, a senator perhaps, would wake to a routine that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. His slaves would quietly prepare his simple meal of bread and perhaps some cheese. His toga, a heavy prescribed garment of unbleached wool, would be laid out. The process of dressing was slow, a ritual in itself. He would receive a few clients, lesser citizens or freedmen, who would arrive for the salutazione, the morning greeting, offering respect and perhaps a small favor in exchange for patronage. This was a quiet, formal exchange, often taking place while the rest of the city was still stretching its limbs. As the morning progressed, the center of gravity shifted toward the Forum Romanum. This was the heart of the Republic, an oblong depression between the Capitoline and Palatine hills. The large paving stones of the plaza slowly dried as the sun climbed higher. The buildings that defined the Forum were impressive, yet solid and unadorned by excessive ornamentation. The Curia Hostilia, the Senate House, a rectangular building where political deliberation occurred. The Rostra, the speaker's platform, where men addressed the crowds. And the various basilicas, long columnar halls used for legal proceedings and business. Political tension in this quiet, early world was not a sudden explosion, but a deep structural creak in the foundations of the Republic. It was the result of 2 centuries of slow accumulation. The immense wealth flowing in from newly conquered provinces, which enriched the senatorial class beyond measure, and the continuous displacement of small farmers who, their lands neglected during long military campaigns, were forced to drift into Rome, swelling the ranks of the urban poor. The tension manifested in small daily ways. It was the senator who, stepping out of his large domus, might feel the momentary, unsettling gaze of a hungry, unwashed citizen on the street. It was the subtle, cold calculation in the eyes of 2 powerful families who were allied one year and bitter rivals the next, always maneuvering for the consulship, the highest elected office. The laws were clear, written, and respected, but the spirit of compromise and equality was slowly eroding, piece by piece, not in a single dramatic battle, but in the long, drawn-out boredom of Senate debates, where one powerful faction could simply delay, obstruct, and wear down the other until the desired result was achieved. The Republic was not failing quickly. It was simply settling, slowly, into an unbalanced state.
Young Gaius Julius Caesar was born into this world of slow, systemic tension around the year 100 BC. His family, the Julii, were patricians, members of Rome's oldest aristocracy. But by this time they were not among the most wealthy or politically influential. They possessed an ancient lineage, tracing their origins, according to tradition, back to the goddess Venus and the Trojan hero Aeneas. But they lacked the immediate political currency of new money and recent military glory. Caesar's childhood was spent in their Subura, a vibrant, noisy, and densely populated district of Rome. While his family's domus would have been substantial and well-appointed, the Subura itself was a chaotic mix of life. Crowded insulae, shops, taverns, and the constant throbbing noise of a large working population. It was not a grand, quiet neighborhood of the ultra-rich, but a place where the powerful mingled daily with the masses. His daily routine would have been characterized by the rigorous structure of Roman education. Roman boys of his class did not attend public schools. Instead, a pedagogos, often a well-educated Greek slave or freedman, would oversee his instruction. The early hours of the morning were dedicated to letters. He learned to read, write, and calculate with the heavy, unhelpful Roman numerals. He learned Roman grammar, the principles of rhetoric, the art of persuasive public speaking, and, critically, Greek. Greek was the language of philosophy, science, and high culture, an indispensable tool for a young man destined for public life. The lessons were slow and repetitive. He would practice copying texts onto wax tablets with a stylus. The noise of the city would filter through the walls, the rhythmic hammering of a metal worker, the distant shouting of a vendor, the bleating of a few sheep being driven through the streets. His afternoons were often devoted to physical training, running, wrestling, and learning to handle weapons. Roman tradition dictated that a public figure must be both mentally and physically robust. These exercises were not designed for sport, but for the harsh reality of military command that awaited every senatorial son. He would listen to the slow, meticulous recounting of Roman history, the virtues of the early kings, the stern honesty of the first consuls, and the foundational myths of the Republic. The heroes were not passionate or flamboyant. They were disciplined, dutiful, and devoted to the collective good of the state, even if it required personal sacrifice. These stories were delivered not with excitement, but with the steady, measured tone of historical fact. His family background placed him within the populares political faction, those who generally favored the common people and pursued reforms through tribunes and popular assemblies, in contrast to the optimates, who favored the Senate's authority. This association was inherited through his aunt, Julia, who had married Gaius Marius, a famous general and multiple-time consul, who had recently died. The traditions that shaped him were rigid. Respect for the mos majorum, the custom of the ancestors, dictated a strict adherence to duty, modesty, and public service. Every action, every word was measured against the standards set by generations of Roman statesmen. There was no room for impulsive behavior or open, excessive displays of emotion. The path to power was not a sprint, but a decades-long patient walk through a prescribed series of offices, the cursus honorum. Young Caesar knew with the quiet certainty of tradition that his life was already mapped out: military service, minor magistratures, the Senate, and eventually, if fate allowed, the consulship.
Rome's political machinery. The machinery of Roman governance was characterized by its complexity, its deliberate slowness, and its dependence on formality. The Senate, the central administrative body, held no absolute legal power, but its authority, the auctoritas, was immense, based on tradition, experience, and the collective prestige of its members. A senator's day, when the Senate was in session, began with a slow, formal procession to the Curia. Inside, the proceedings were characterized by immense patience and often profound boredom. The Senate House was a plain, rectangular chamber. Senators sat on simple wooden benches. The debates were long, delivered in the formal, structured language of Latin oratory. The presiding magistrate, a consul or a praetor, would introduce the matter. Then the most senior and respected senators would be called upon in order of rank to offer their opinions. A speech could last for hours. It was considered a valid form of opposition not to argue against a proposal, but simply to speak
at such length and with such exhaustive detail that the sun would set, forcing the session to end without a vote. This was the mechanism of the intercessio, the procedural delay, a tool wielded not with dramatic fervor, but with calm, deliberate exhaustion. The voting itself was often indirect. Senators would simply walk to stand on the side of the room representing the opinion they supported, a process called pedibus ire, to go with one's feet. Among the powerful figures maneuvering within this slow, formal system were Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Pompey was not a legendary figure to his contemporaries, but a man of exceptional military competence who had benefited from several lucky breaks and the timely deaths of rivals. He was reserved, perhaps slightly insecure, and prone to long, thoughtful silences. He possessed an immense reputation from his military campaigns in Spain and against the pirates, a reputation that made him indispensable. Crassus, on the other hand, was defined by his wealth. He had made a colossal fortune through methodical, sometimes ruthless, business dealings, speculating on property and famously training his own private fire brigade, which would rush to burning buildings and offer to purchase the structure at a rock-bottom price before extinguishing the flames. He was a man of quiet, calculating ambition, deeply sensitive to status, but often uncomfortable in the public glare of political rhetoric. Their political conversations were not dramatic strategy sessions, but long, drawn-out affairs held in the peristyles of their large homes, or perhaps a quiet corner of the forum. They would discuss the distribution of provincial commands, the funding of new infrastructure, or the subtle phrasing of a law to benefit their clients. Imagine a conversation between Pompey and Crassus on a warm afternoon. They would speak slowly, methodically. "The command in Asia," Crassus might say, leaning back slightly on a low marble bench, "must be settled before the next elections. The costs of the eastern frontier are significant. They require a consul with a steady hand and access to significant personal resources, which the treasury is currently indisclined to provide." Pompey, perhaps tracing the pattern in the mosaic floor with the tip of his sandal, would respond, "The Senate will delay. Cato's faction will raise the question of precedent. The tribunes will argue for popular oversight of the expenditure. Weeks will be consumed by the formality of the debate. Weeks of no movement, no progress, while the legions wait." The substance of the exchange was not about personal glory, but about the slow, grinding mechanics of patronage, finance, and procedural control. Nothing was accomplished quickly. Every success was the result of long-term planning, patient negotiation, and the steady accumulation of small, nearly invisible political debts. The political scene was a vast, slow-moving tide, not a series of crashing waves.
The life of a Roman soldier in the late Republic was less defined by the sudden, glorious clash of battle and more by the immense continuous labor of movement and waiting. A legion on the march was a monument to slow, deliberate endurance. The early morning in a temporary camp, or castra, began well before dawn. The sound of the cornicen, the hornblower, would signal the start of the day. The soldiers, sleeping tent to a tent, would wake slowly, shake off the deep chill of the night, and begin the routine of dismantling the camp. Every single element of the camp, from the sharpened wooden stakes of the palisade to the leather tents, had to be taken down, rolled, and packed precisely. This process was repetitive and silent, broken only by the sharp, measured commands of the centurions. There was no discussion, only execution. The march itself was an exercise in pure physical monotony. The Roman legionary carried a staggering load. His lorica, shield, armor, a heavy pack containing a few days' rations, a cooking pot, tools, and the crucial element, 2 wooden stakes to build the knight's palisade. The total weight was often over 60 Roman pounds. They marched not on paved roads, but across rough country, their pace dictated by the slow, grinding movement of the supply train. Hour after hour they moved, in deep, structured columns, 4 men abreast, shoulder to shoulder, dust rising from their heavy sandals and their faces grimed with sweat and earth. The weather was the constant, neutral antagonist. Under the summer sun, the heat was suffocating, and the soldiers marched with their heavy helmets tilted back, sweating profusely, their thirst a perpetual ache. In the rain, the mud was deep, clinging to their boots and dragging at their gait, turning the column into a slow churning line of sodden cloth and polished bronze. When they stopped, usually in the late afternoon, the slow, methodical labor began again. The first task was the construction of the new castra. The process was never skipped for a single night. A ditch was dug, the fossa, and the earth piled up to form an embankment, the agger. The palisade stakes they had carried all day were then driven into the top of the embankment to form a defensive wall. The routine was tedious. The steady thud-thud of mallets driving stakes, the scrape of the dolabra, the soldiers' combination pickaxe and shovel against the earth, and the measured shouts of the centurions directing the construction. It was an atmosphere not of immediate threat, but of profound systematic preparedness. Evening brought the only respite. After a meal of hardtack, boiled grain, and perhaps a small portion of meat or wine, the soldiers would sit in their tents. There was no glory in the conversation, only fatigue. They would discuss the quality of the last ration, the severity of a centurion, the interminable length of their enlistment. They spoke not of future triumphs, but of the simple, immediate goal of surviving the day's march and the night's watch. Military life for the common soldier was a slow-motion study of regulated discomfort, a long, quiet exercise in discipline, where the greatest enemy was not a foreign tribe, but the ceaseless neutral pressure of the physical world. Caesar as a public figure. As Julius Caesar slowly ascended the cursus honorum from quaestor to aedile to praetor and finally to consul, his public presence was not characterized by sudden, shocking displays, but by a methodical, well-managed clarity. His speeches in the Forum were the result of years of disciplined study in rhetoric. He spoke not with the dramatic, sweeping gestures of an actor, but with a calm, precise delivery. His voice was well-pitched and strong enough to carry over the milling crowds, but the content was always structured, logical, and aimed at the specific points of law or policy. He was not prone to flowery digressions. His style was direct, often described as nitidus, polished and unadorned. When he spoke from the rostra, the public reaction was slow, a gradual wave of acceptance or dissent that moved through the thousands of citizens gathered in the Forum. The crowd, a dense mixture of poor citizens in rough tunics, freedmen, slaves, and a scattering of better-dressed clients, did not erupt in immediate, passionate cheers. Instead, a few initial murmurs of agreement would spread, becoming a low, sustained hum of approval, or perhaps a scattering of slow, sustained shouts of disapproval. The atmosphere was not that of a modern rally, but of a large outdoor assembly where individuals were struggling to hear and process complex legal or political arguments. A good speech was one that was clear enough to be understood by a tired, sun-drenched populace. As aedile, Caesar sponsored public games and festivals. These were immense logistical undertakings, not spontaneous celebrations. The games, gladiatorial contests, theatrical performances were meticulously planned, often financed by massive personal debt. The public's reaction to these displays was not of wild excitement, but a deep, quiet satisfaction. The citizens expected their magistrates to provide such entertainment, and Caesar provided it with systematic generosity. It was an investment in public memory, a slow burn of goodwill that would prove invaluable later. His reforms, particularly during his consulship, were introduced with the same patient, deliberate tone. The most significant was the Lex Agraria, the land distribution law, which aimed to settle poor citizens and veteran soldiers on public lands. This was not presented as a revolutionary act, but as a neutral, administrative correction. He argued calmly and often that the Republic required a broad base of productive, settled citizens, and that the soldiers who had served Rome deserved the promised recompense. The law was debated in the Senate with the usual long delays and procedural obstruction. When he bypassed the Senate and presented the law directly to the popular assembly, the Comitia Tributa, the reaction was still measured. The citizens were voting on a practical matter of economic security. They understood that the land meant stability for their families. Their approval was expressed not through ecstatic celebration, but through the calm, methodical casting of their votes. Caesar's public career was a lesson in slow, methodical accumulation, the accumulation of debts, the accumulation of public goodwill, and the accumulation of political authority, achieved not through shock, but through consistency and relentless, clear-headed execution of his public duties. The Senate's fear. The men who would eventually become Caesar's assassins, Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus among them, were not characterized by sudden malice or dramatic villainous intent. They were, primarily, tired politicians, deeply invested in the slow, formal traditions of the Republic, and increasingly weary of a world that seemed to be moving too quickly for the constitutional checks to catch up. Brutus, in particular, was the intellectual descendant of Rome's sternest republican virtue. He was a student of philosophy, deeply committed to the ideal of the Republic, where no single man, not even one of immense talent, should overshadow the authority of the Senate and the rule of law. His temperament was reserved, intellectual, and cautious. His concerns were not personal, but constitutional. Cassius, more pragmatic and perhaps more ambitious, was motivated by a similar commitment to the oligarchic structure, coupled with a deep, lingering resentment of Caesar's increasing personal power, which he saw as a profound insult to his own dignity and that of his class. Their meetings, which began in the aftermath of the Civil War and the final defeat of Pompey, were long, tedious, and filled with doubt and hesitation. They did not gather in dramatic, torch-lit chambers, but in the quiet of private libraries or the shaded peristyles of their homes, often late in the evening when the city's noise had quieted. The conversation would circle the same points, slowly, methodically. One senator would state, his voice low and devoid of anger, merely stating a clinical fact. The dictator perpetuo. He has assumed the dictatorship not for 6 months, not for the duration of a crisis, but for life. The precedent is broken. The Senate's authority is hollow. Brutus might respond, his face drawn with the weight of philosophical commitment, "We swore an oath to the Republic, not to an individual. The laws are meant to restrain all men, even the greatest. If he respects no restraint, then the state itself is no longer Rome." The planning was not a sudden burst of conspiratorial excitement, but a series of slow, agonizing decisions. They debated the morality of the act, the practicalities of security, and, most importantly, the aftermath. They had no contingency plan beyond the simple belief that once the tyrant was removed, the republic would naturally snap back into its traditional, slow-moving constitutional form. The atmosphere of their meetings was heavy with the weight of history and the fear of failure. They were men of procedure, thrust into an act of profound and terrifying illegality. They moved with the slowness of men who felt they were walking on thin ice, every step calculated, every word whispered. They were tired, not heroes or villains, but simply men who could not tolerate the silent, methodical erosion of the constitutional order they had been raised to serve.
The Ides of March, 25th March 44 B.C., began like any other day in Rome, slowly and routinely. There was no sense of impending catastrophe in the air, only the usual dampness of the pre-dawn hours. Caesar, who was now dictator perpetuo, woke in his domus in the Forum area. His morning routine was unchanged. The quiet preparations by his household staff, the slow, formal process of dressing, the brief salutatio with a few high-ranking clients. The conversations were about the day's agenda, the need to address the Senate, which was meeting not in the usual curia, but in the hall attached to Pompey's new theater, the Curia of Pompey, as the traditional curia was still under reconstruction. The Forum began to awaken. Citizens moved toward their places of business. Vendors set up their stalls. The sky was an indifferent pale blue. Caesar's progress from his home toward the theater of Pompey was slow, as was his custom. He did not rush. He was accompanied by a small retinue of lictors, carrying the fasces, the bundles of rods symbolizing the power of the state, and the small group of aides. The atmosphere of his walk was professional, bureaucratic. He was going to a meeting. As he walked, he received scrolls and petitions, accepting them with a customary unhurried hand. The famous story of the soothsayer warning him about the Ides of March may or may not have occurred, but if it did, the exchange was likely a quiet, brief interruption, a piece of superstitious background noise in a busy morning. At the Curia of Pompey, a large rectangular meeting hall near the massive theater complex built by his former rival, the senators were already assembled. They waited, sitting on their benches. The atmosphere was one of quiet, expectant formality. The conspirators, hidden amongst the crowd of senators, were themselves anxious, speaking in low, clipped sentences. Their movements were subtle, blending into the normal, slow shifting of bodies in a crowded room. Caesar entered the hall. The senators, by custom, rose to their feet. The session began with the usual formality. Caesar took his seat on his gilded chair, the only man to sit in the presence of the Senate. A small distraction was initiated. Tullius Cimber approached Caesar, petitioning for the return of his exiled brother. This was the signal. As Cimber grasped at Caesar's toga, pulling it down from his neck,
an aggressive but perhaps not immediately alarming gesture in the heat of a petition, the first dagger appeared. It was not a sudden coordinated attack, but a chaotic slow-motion struggle. The senators rose from their benches. The initial attack was disorganized. Caesar first resisted, shouting, but as the daggers began to descend, small, clumsy, and ineffective at first, the struggle became a silent, desperate scramble. The key moment was the appearance of Brutus, who had approached the scene slowly with a face devoid of emotion. When Caesar saw his face, he simply stopped resisting. The struggle ended. The body fell slowly, heavily, near the base of a large statue of Pompey, which silently presided over the scene. The immediate aftermath was not a burst of drama, but a sudden, terrifying silence. The conspirators stood, daggers dripping, looking at each other with a mixture of terror and disbelief. They had committed an act of immense violence, and the noise of the struggle had ceased, replaced by the profound, ringing silence of the large chamber.
Aftermath. The silence that fell over the curia of Pompeii slowly spread across the city of Rome. The conspirators, armed with their bloodied daggers, rushed out into the forum, attempting to address the populace. Their shouts of liberty, freedom is restored, were met not with cheers, but with a confused, stunned silence. The first reaction of the ordinary citizens was not one of revolutionary zeal, but of profound confusion and fear. Nobody knew who was in power. Nobody knew who was safe. The immediate rational response of the city was to close up. Shops were quickly shuttered. Doors to the insulae were barred. The noise of the city, that continuous hum of commerce and life, abruptly ceased. The forum, which had been so densely packed hours before, emptied with unnatural speed. The great paving stones of the plaza lay bare and silent under the afternoon sun. A few guards and slaves, now without a clear master, drifted aimlessly. The routine of the city did not collapse, but simply paused, like a large, complicated machine whose central gear had suddenly been removed. In the high-walled domus of the senators, the atmosphere was one of nervous, quiet calculation. The news traveled slowly, by word of mouth and hurried, whispered conversations between slaves and messengers. The politicians who had not been part of the plot, men like Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal second-in-command, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, began the slow, careful process of assessing the balance of power. Antony, a man of deep military experience and practical temperament, understood that the conspirators had failed to secure the necessary public support or the immediate loyalty of the legions. He moved slowly, deliberately, to secure Caesar's state funds and papers. The body of Caesar, still lying in the curia, was a logistical problem. It had to be moved. This was done quietly, without fanfare, by a few loyal slaves and family members. It was a matter of grim, practical necessity. The following days were dominated not by war, but by long, drawn-out negotiations. Antony and the conspirators agreed to a slow, formal compromise.
a general amnesty for the assassins in exchange for the ratification of Caesar's acts and decrees. The Republic continued to function on paper, its laws still being read, its magistrates still holding office. The assassination was not a dramatic ending, but a new, complex beginning. The great machine of Rome, defined by its immense size and its dependence on routine, could not stop for one man. It simply paused, shifted its weight, and slowly, deliberately began to turn again. The future was profoundly uncertain, but the day-to-day rhythm of Roman life, the salutatio, the Senate meeting, the market transactions, continued its measured, inevitable crawl forward.
The reading of the will and the funeral pyre. The fragile, temporary calm brokered between the assassins and the Caesarian faction began to crack during the public reading of Caesar's will. This event, which took place in the house of Mark Antony, was not a grand public spectacle initially, but a slow, careful administrative proceeding intended to settle the dictator's vast personal affairs. The key revelations in the will were delivered in a calm, monotonous tone by the reader, a public secretary. Caesar formally adopted his grand-nephew, the young Gaius Octavius, making him his principal heir. This single, quiet announcement had immediate, profound consequences, creating a powerful new claimant to Caesar's legacy, a boy who would soon be known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. But it was the next detail that affected the masses. Caesar bequeathed a substantial amount of money, 300 sesterces, to every single citizen of Rome, and left his vast gardens across the Tiber to be converted into a public park. This news spread through the city, not as a sudden cheer, but a deep, grateful murmur among the urban poor. It transformed Caesar in the public mind from a mere politician or general into a benevolent benefactor, a true father of the people. The monetary bequest was a tangible, undeniable benefit, a quiet act of immense generosity that immediately discredited the assassins' claim that they had freed the people from a tyrant. The subsequent funeral, days later, was scheduled to be a purely formal state affair, conducted with the usual Roman sobriety. But the popular sentiment, slowly built up by the will, made the event something more. The funeral was held in the Forum. The central element was the rostrum, the speaker's platform, upon which a temporary, elaborate shrine had been constructed, crowned by a likeness of the deceased. The custom dictated that the body itself, encased in a simple wooden coffin, be brought to the rostra. Mark Antony, as the surviving consul and Caesar's colleague, was charged with delivering the traditional eulogy. His speech was not a passionate cry for vengeance, but a masterpiece of slow, deliberate rhetorical suggestion. He spoke of Caesar's long service,
his battles fought for Rome, and the honors the Senate itself had bestowed upon him. He read aloud the list of acts confirmed by the Senate, which now guaranteed the validity of Caesar's will. Then Antony slowly displayed Caesar's blood-stained toga. He did not accuse the conspirators by name, but pointed with long, deliberate pauses to the holes in the fabric. Reciting the favors and friendships Caesar had once extended to the men who had struck the blows. He moved slowly, allowing the immense, dense crowd to process the visual evidence and the subtle accusations. The reaction of the crowd was not immediate hysteria, but a slow, internal shift from mournful respect to simmering anger. The people began to move forward, not running, but walking with a slow, powerful momentum toward the funeral pyre. The pyre, initially a formal stack of wood for the state rites, was transformed. Citizens, overcome with a slow burning grief and a new sense of injustice, began to throw whatever they had onto the pyre: their clothing, their household goods, the wreaths they carried, even the musical instruments of the attending musicians. The fire became immense, a silent, roaring symbol of popular outrage. The assassins, who had been watching from their fortified houses on the Capitoline Hill, knew immediately that the delicate peace had failed. The violence that followed was not a sudden, coordinated uprising, but isolated, slow acts of searching and retribution, focused on their homes and properties. The Republic had not been saved. It had simply moved from a state of quiet crisis to one of slow gathering anarchy.
The emergence of Octavian. The quiet world of Rome was further complicated by the arrival of the adopted heir, Octavian. He was just 18 years old, studying in Apollonia, in modern Albania, with the legions preparing for a Parthian campaign, when the news of Caesar's death arrived. His journey back to Rome was slow and deliberate. He did not rush, understanding instinctively that impatience was fatal in Roman politics. He landed at Brundisium, the port city in southeastern Italy, and began the long, methodical journey up the Appian Way. Along the road, he encountered the veterans of Caesar's legions. These were not undisciplined mobs, but hardened, retired soldiers living on their small land grants. They recognized the name. They respected the legacy, and they approached him with the slow, measured deference they reserved for a commander. They offered their loyalty not with fiery oaths, but with quiet, professional commitment. When Octavian finally entered Rome, he presented himself not as a dramatic revolutionary, but as a young man with a heavy burden of inheritance. His first task was administrative, to formally accept his adoption and assume the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. His initial interactions with Mark Antony were characterized by quiet, mutual suspicion. Antony, the seasoned military commander, saw Octavian as a mere boy, an unexpected complication. Octavian saw Antony as the temporary custodian of his father's power, a man who needed to be patiently and methodically dislodged. Their conflict was slow-paced and bureaucratic, centered on the simple question of money. Caesar's vast personal fortune was required to pay the public bequests of 300 sesterces per citizen, a promise Octavian was honor-bound to fulfill to secure popular support. Antony, controlling the funds, was reluctant to release them. Octavian's response was a long, systematic borrowing campaign. He sold off his own considerable inherited estates and convinced his family and friends to lend him vast sums of money. This was not a sudden act of charisma, but a quiet, sustained demonstration of commitment to Caesar's legacy, and, crucially, to the Roman people. The slow, methodical distribution of the 300 sesterces to tens of thousands of citizens cemented his image as the rightful heir and benefactor. His political speeches were delivered in the Forum with the same controlled, measured tone as Caesar's. He spoke of piety, pietas, duty to his father's memory and to the Republic. He patiently explained his financial difficulties and his commitment to fulfilling the dictator's promises. The Senate, led by the aging, eloquent orator Cicero, watched this slow-motion struggle with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Cicero, fearing Antony's power and misjudging Octavian as a pliable youth, began to slowly cultivate the young man, seeing him as a tool to neutralize the more dangerous Antony. The alliance was fragile, based on the shared, quiet calculation that the enemy of my enemy is my temporary friend. The political world was now defined by three forces: the tired, hesitant assassins, the powerful, military-minded Antony, and the young, methodical Octavian, all moving slowly, calculating their next patient step on the fragile ground of the collapsing Republic.
The eventual formation of the Second Triumvirate, a political alliance between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, was not a partnership of trust, but a necessity born of shared external threats. This alliance was finalized after weeks of quiet negotiation on a small island near Bononia, and their first order of business was to consolidate power through proscriptions, the systematic, slow elimination of political opponents. The proscriptions were carried out with brutal, bureaucratic efficiency. Names of senators and wealthy citizens deemed enemies of the state were slowly added to public lists. These lists were posted in the Forum, and the slow, methodical horror began. The citizens of Rome, accustomed to political violence, did not panic in a frenzy, but entered a state of sustained, quiet dread. People stayed indoors. Commerce slowed to a crawl. The daily routines of the city were maintained, but with a new, fearful silence hanging over the streets, punctuated only by the occasional, slow sound of soldiers moving through the streets, searching for the proscribed. Following this consolidation, the focus shifted to the east, where Brutus and Cassius had gathered the remaining Republican legions. The resulting campaign, culminating in the battles of Philippi,
was a long, grueling affair of marching and maneuvering, not a swift engagement. The Roman army, led by Antony and Octavian, marched for months across vast distances. The daily life of the soldier was again dominated by endless routine, building the castra, fetching water, repairing equipment, and the slow, inevitable movement toward the enemy. The battles of Philippi themselves, fought over 2 engagements weeks apart, were less about dramatic heroism and more about grinding military competence. Antony, the superior general, skillfully commanded the legions. Octavian, who was younger and often ill, focused on maintaining supply lines and managing the political dimension. The defeat and subsequent suicides of Brutus and Cassius were quiet, anticlimactic ends to their long struggle. The news returned to Rome slowly, by messenger, and was received not with jubilation, but with the quiet understanding that one faction of the civil war was finally, definitively defeated. With the assassins gone, the second triumvirate slowly devolved into a power struggle between the 2 main figures, Antony and Octavian. The Mediterranean world was divided. Antony took the rich east, Octavian the politically complex west, and Lepidus the quiet provinces of Africa. The years that followed were not marked by immediate dramatic conflict, but by a slow geographic drifting apart. Antony slowly integrated himself into the wealth and culture of the East, becoming absorbed in his relationship with Cleopatra. Octavian remained in Italy, patiently rebuilding his base, cultivating the veterans, and meticulously tending to the needs of Rome and Italy: roads, water supply, public order. The final confrontation, years later, was prepared for slowly. Octavian did not rush to war. He spent months, years building the legal and popular case against Antony, portraying him not as a worthy enemy, but as a man who had abandoned Roman tradition for the corrupt luxury of the East. The Battle of Actium, the final naval engagement, was not a chaotic clash, but a slow, methodical blockade and naval maneuvering. Antony and Cleopatra's forces were outmaneuvered, and their eventual retreat was a sign of a slow, dissolving will, not a dramatic defeat. The subsequent invasion of Egypt by Octavian was careful and patient. Antony and Cleopatra's final acts of desperation and suicide were private, quiet affairs, marking the definitive, slow end of the Roman Republic. The entire decades-long process was a systematic, quiet removal of all constitutional and military challenges to one-man rule, achieved through patience, administration, and relentless, slow-paced political maneuvering. The quiet establishment of the empire. With the death of Antony and Cleopatra, and the full incorporation of Egypt into the Roman state, the long series of civil wars was finally over. The year 29 BC marked the beginning of a profound, quiet shift in the governance of the Roman world. Octavian returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. His actions were deliberate, cautious, and designed to appear constitutional. There were no immediate grand declarations of a new monarchy. Instead, the process of establishing the empire was one of slow, incremental accumulation of titles and powers, carefully veiled behind the facade of the restored republic. He systematically demobilized the vast armies, settling hundreds of thousands of veteran soldiers onto land grants across Italy and the provinces. This was an immense logistical undertaking, executed not with drama, but with the methodical precision of a massive administrative project. The result was the quiet, powerful loyalty of the legions and a vast reduction in internal military threats. In 27 BC, a pivotal moment occurred, orchestrated with deceptive simplicity. Octavian appeared before the Senate and solemnly declared that he was restoring the Republic. He symbolically handed back his extraordinary powers, stating that the crisis was over and the traditional government should resume. The senators, many of whom were his own clients or tired of decades of war, received this news not with revolutionary excitement, but with cautious relief. They knew that a true return to the contentious, chaotic republic was impossible. They insisted, with polite deference, that he retain certain powers necessary for the state's security. This slow, choreographed exchange resulted in the Senate bestowing upon him the title Augustus, a term suggesting venerable, sacred authority, and granting him the proconsular imperium over the most important provinces, like Gaul, Spain, and Egypt, thereby placing the majority of the legions under his direct, permanent command. He held the consulship repeatedly, and eventually the tribunicia potestas, the power of the tribune, which gave him the authority to convene the Senate, veto legislation, and protect the people, all while carefully avoiding the title of king or dictator. He simply accumulated the powers of many offices into a single person, maintaining the appearance of the old constitution. The result was a state of being that the Romans called Pax Augusta, the Augustan peace. It was a peace achieved not through a single dramatic victory, but through the long, quiet process of exhausting all political and military opposition. The Forum, the stage of so much dramatic history, slowly settled into its new role as a beautiful, monumental center of a stable state. The streets were safer, the water supply was improved, public works projects proceeded with calm efficiency. The citizens of Rome, exhausted by generations of civil strife, embraced this new order, not with passion, but with deep, quiet satisfaction.
They understood that their freedom to vote and debate was constrained, but their freedom from fear, famine, and ceaseless war was now secure. The Republic had not been violently overthrown. It had been slowly, patiently, and methodically repurposed. Augustus simply held the key powers of the state, allowing the senators to continue their debates, the magistrates their duties, and the citizens their routines under the steady, unchanging umbrella of his paramount authority. The long, tumultuous journey from Julius Caesar's ambition to the quiet, administrative efficiency of the Augustan Empire was complete.
As the days continued, Rome did not pause to reflect on what it had become. The streets opened each morning as they always had. Officials arrived at their offices not with urgency, but with familiarity. Messages were read, responded to, and set aside. Augustus remained present, but rarely visible. Decisions were made quietly. Most days passed without record. The city breathed in its own slow rhythm. Nothing needed to be decided immediately. Nothing needed to be resolved tonight. And so Rome continued, not rushing toward the future, not dwelling on the past, simply moving forward, one unremarkable day at a time. As the days continued, Rome did not pause to reflect on what it had become. There were no announcements made for ordinary mornings. No one stood in the streets to mark the passing of another peaceful night. The streets opened each morning as they always had. Stone pathways warming slowly as the sun rose, vendors unlocking wooden shutters without speaking much, footsteps passing one another without attention or urgency. Officials arrived at their offices at familiar hours, not early, not late. They greeted one another with small nods, sat at their desks, and waited for the day to unfold in its usual, predictable way. Messages were unrolled, read once, sometimes twice, then placed aside to be considered later, or quietly forgotten altogether. Ink dried. Seals were pressed. Nothing required haste. Augustus remained present in the city, though he was rarely seen and even less often discussed. His influence moved slowly, through letters, through decisions made in private rooms, through routines that no longer needed explanation. Most days passed without record. No speeches were remembered. No moments were marked for future generations. The absence of crisis became ordinary. The city continued to breathe in its own rhythm. Water moved through aqueducts. Shadows shifted across columns. Voices echoed briefly, then faded into the stone. Nothing needed to be decided immediately. Nothing pressed against the night demanding resolution. Tomorrow would arrive whether anyone prepared for it or not. And so Rome continued, not rushing toward the future, not lingering on memories of violence or ambition, simply existing within the steady pattern of its days. One sunrise followed another. One evening settled gently into the next, and the city carried on, without announcement, without conclusion, one unremarkable day at a time.
If you have remained here, listening quietly, then this slow pace may already feel familiar to you. This channel exists for evenings like this, for nights that move slowly, when the mind prefers steady voices and stories that do not ask for attention. Here, stories from history continue in the same way, unhurried, undramatic, returning again and again to calm moments, ordinary lives, and long passages of time. New stories are added gently, one after another, without urgency, waiting patiently to be found whenever another quiet night arrives. There is no need to remember this moment, no need to decide anything tonight. The stories will remain here, ready whenever rest comes first. For now, the night can continue as it is, slow, uninterrupted, and undemanding.